Welcome. This video is a recording of a live program previously presented by the Cincinnati Asian Art Society. CAS is a volunteer-run, nonprofit organization open to anyone interested in the visual and performing arts of China, Japan, Korea, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East.
Welcome to the Cincinnati Asian Art Society March 15, 2006 program. I'm Helen Rinsberg, president of the Society. We're happy that you could join us today. Our presentation is Making the Desert Bloom, the Art, Architecture, and Archaeology of the Nabataeans. Our presenter, Dr. Sarah Wenner, will bring us first-hand accounts based on her work excavating Nabataean sites. Dr. Wenner is the jointly appointed provenance researcher and object historian at the Cincinnati Art Museum and assistant principal, and assistant professor of archaeology at the American Center of Research in Amman, Jordan. She first started at CAM during the reinstallation of the ancient Middle Eastern Gallery in 2019. She is currently establishing the museum's provenance standards and is serving on the curatorial committee for a show on ancient queenship in the Mediterranean and West Asia that will come to us in 2027. I know, it's very cool. Sarah has worked in Jordan for over a decade, including as assistant director of the Petra Garden and Pool Project and as associate director of the Humayya Excavation Project. In addition to excavation reports and analysis of ancient ceramics, Sarah has authored Centering the Periphery, Nabataean Art at Khirbet et-Tannur, and Cincinnati and a Gem of a Small Nabataean Temple, both in the catalog accompanying the reinstallation of CAM's Ancient Middle East Gallery, and the chapter on Roman Arabia in A Companion to the Archaeology of the Roman Empire. Dr. Wenner earned her PhD from the Department of Classics at the University of Cincinnati in 2023. She is an expert in the ceramic traditions of southern Jordan during Roman times. Dr. Wenner has worked at numerous sites in the region, including Petra, Aila, Humayma, Erdhu, Wadi Ruman, and Khirbet et-Kaldi, as well as Pompeii, Thanos in Sardinia, and Monticello in the United States. Let's please welcome Dr. Sarah Wenner.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. It's so nice to see you all on such a lovely day outside, although maybe the wind swept you in here. I'm happy to see everyone. Okay, without further ado, the Nabataeans first enter the historical record as villains, cast in that role by the Greek author Diodorus Siculus. Diodorus recorded the aftermath of Alexander the Great's death and the power struggle that occurred between his generals. In 312 BCE, Antigonus, Alexander's general who came to control much of Asia Minor, sent his friend Athenaeus, not an accurate depiction, into the land of Eden, now controlled by the enigmatic and wealthy Nabataeans. Accompanied by 4,000 foot soldiers and 600 cavalry, Athenaeus must have thought his task was one easily accomplished, and he moved against the Nabataeans who were congregating at a rock. Perhaps this. During the night, he attacked those he found there, retreating before dawn with prisoners and the Nabataean stocks of frankincense, myrrh, and 500 talents of silver. The Greeks then fled 200 stades, over 20 miles, to a place that they believed secure from their barbarous foe. But Athenaeus underestimated his victims. While he and his men slept, the Nabataeans, perhaps as many as 8,000 in number, attacked the Greek camp. According to Diodorus, only 50 cavalry escaped with their lives. When word of Athenaeus' tragic failure reached Antigonus, the former general feigned apologetic, attempting to hide his continued desire for Nabataean wealth and land. Sometime later, he sent another force, this time led by his son Demetrius, to punish the Nabataeans. When Demetrius arrived back in Nabataean territory, he found that they had again retreated into their rock. Desperate that the Greek efforts not fail again, he made multiple attempts to breach the Nabataean stronghold over multiple days. But like Athenaeus, Demetrius ultimately failed in his attempt to conquer the Nabataeans, thwarted by the arid landscape, lack of access to water, and Nabataean wherewithal. It should come as no surprise that ancient accounts of the Nabataeans, both from Diodorus and others, are heavily freighted by Greco-Roman fears and biases. Diodorus casts account of these encounters, casts the Nabataeans as barbarians, inhabiting a desert landscape incapable of producing life's necessities, water, grain, and of course wine. If left to classical writers, the Nabataeans would be viewed as a people both primitive and inordinately obsessed with luxury, both innocent and cunning, both, quote, exceptionally fond of freedom, and who choose to live a life, quote, altogether like that of wild beasts. So who were these freedom and luxury-loving barbarians in reality? This is the topic we will explore today, looking at the art, architecture, and archaeology of the Nabataeans, primarily at Petra. I'll first give you a bit more background using the archaeological evidence to consider the history of the Nabataeans when they were a non-sedentary people in the first millennium BCE, and work towards the construction of the beautiful and complex cultural tradition that becomes readily apparent in the late 1st century BCE. We will tour through Petra and look at the particular messaging behind their art and architecture, which signaled to the massive land empires to their east and west that they were a powerful political entity with their own distinct identities. Then, briefly before I'll end, I'll talk about the two remarkable new discoveries we made at Humaima in 2025, a Nabataean site about halfway between Petra and Aqaba. In the late 1st millennium BCE, the Nabataeans were caravan traders, facilitating the trade of incense over the Arabian Peninsula. They had possibly seized control of the incense trade from the Khidrites, an Arab tribe that had controlled the Hejaz and the Negev in the beginning of the 4th century BCE. The origin remains obscure, but some have theorized that they may have been Edomites, as theirs was the region that the Nabataeans came to control, and they had certainly consolidated their regional power to some degree by the end of the 4th century BCE. The immateriality of their lifestyle makes it difficult to trace the evolution of early Nabataean power as well as their geographic presence. But by the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, some were building more permanent structures in the region of Medin Sala, ancient Hegra in current Saudi Arabia, and Petra, ancient Ramku in current-day Jordan. In the 1st century BCE, the Nabataeans became more deeply entrenched in the affairs occurring within the region of Syria-Palestine, perhaps as a result both of a power vacuum left by the declining Seleucid Empire and a Ptolemaic threat to Nabataean dominance of the long-distance trade over the Arabian Peninsula. So essentially, the Ptolemies, those in Egypt, were looking to take away some of the incense that the Nabataeans were controlling over the Arabian Peninsula. At approximately the same time, Nabataean material culture, or at least the material recovered through archaeological means, amplified. It is at this point that many scholars assume the Nabataeans did the logical thing and adopted inspiration from the Hellenistic and Ptolemaic worlds. Nabataean inscriptions, and indeed a newly discovered Nabataean temple in Italy, do attest to the fact that they traveled widely, visiting places like Alexandria, Seleucia, Rhodes, Kos, Delos, among others. While they surely traveled broadly and encountered various cultures, it discredits Nabataean ingenuity to imply that they acted only as sponges, eager to absorb what others had so carefully crafted. For instance, the Nabataeans had long been known for their ability to manage water within an arid landscape, but in the first half of the 1st century BCE, those engineering skills become even more evident. And with that, the Nabataean ingenuity as hydraulic engineers, we start our tour of Petra, the desert capital that the Nabataeans made flowered, both literally and figuratively. The city's entrance, still used today, is called the Siq. Through this 1.6 kilometer long passageway through the surrounding mountains, the Nabataeans installed a sophisticated gravity-directed water management system that both captured the water that would otherwise flood the city and redirected it to various features. The pass was lined with water channels, often along both sides, that collected the water and ushered it to the city. You can see it on sort of halfway up the left side there and on the bottom on the right. There are places where the original ceramic pipes are still in place. The lack of light and the sound of rushing water must have been concerning to anyone outside of the Nabataean tradition who knew the power of seasonal floods. But Nabataean engineering was so advanced that the system held up for centuries after it stopped being maintained. But this passage was not simply utilitarian or practical. Residents and Nabataean visitors to the city carved inscriptions and sculptures into the walls of the Sikh as testimony to the pilgrimage. Some of the carvings were in the form of aniconic beetles, as the Nabataeans had originally favored non-figurative representations of their gods. More on this later. Closer to the Khazna, also known as the treasury, archaeologists uncovered a depiction of caravaneers and 2 camels. You can see the Sikhs' channels moving behind the legs there. The bottom halves were preserved by the accumulation of soil, while the top halves, exposed to the elements over the centuries, disappeared almost entirely. There is actually another set of camels and a driver near to this one, but they are much more difficult to make out. There is much debate whether these reflect the caravan trade, which represented Petra's economy, or if it was a religious procession because one of the camels may carry a beetle. Since the sacred and profane were not so different in the ancient world, I imagine the sculptures have both economic and religious connotations. In much the same way that the gateway into the Athenian Acropolis played with an individual's sensitivity to light before ultimately allowing admittance to a sacred site, so too did the Sikh. When the Sikh ended, visitors found themselves in front of what is now called the Khazna. After the natural beauty of the craggy rock and the darkness of the mountain path, the building must have been a shock, though an elegant one gleaming in sunlight. We still don't know who was buried there, but it seems logical that it was a Nabataean king or his family, maybe Aretas IV, as the timing is right. Aretas IV is a king that will come up multiple times today. Unlike most of the other tombs in Petra, the Khazna has clear Greco-Roman inspiration. Unfortunately, the sculpture isn't perfectly preserved due to some later iconoclasm and just general weathering, but we can still make out several figures. On the top level are bare-breasted Amazons and Victories, which flank a central figure, thought by some to be Isis Tyche. On the lower level are the heavenly twins, Castor and Pollux, known together as the Dioscuri, who protected the dead on their journeys and are very appropriate figures for a royal tomb facade. All in all, while this monument appears classical in style, and some scholars have attempted to interpret it as such, it was nevertheless rendered in a distinctly Nabataean visual vocabulary. And by that, I mean that the Nabataean sculptors who created this structure understood the iconography of the classical world to their west, but they designed a monument that was meant to represent the Nabataean people and their religious and artistic traditions. Unfortunately, that means much of the Khazna's messages remain unclear to this day. More tombs line the path from the Khazna to the heart of the city. Much scholastic ink has been spilled over when these date. In fact, the tombs have always been the center of Western interest in Petra. There are so many facade tombs in and around the city, 628 in fact, that early explorers thought of Petra as a kingdom of the dead. We know that that's not true now, but there's still overwhelming interest in these. And for good reason, they're beautiful. It is the very nature of the facade tombs and Nabataean burial tradition that makes them so incredibly difficult to date. The tombs were open so that other family members could be continually interred. As a result, most of the tombs were looted in antiquity. So there was this Nabataean practice of visiting family members, dining with family members, and then you move Uncle Jeff over to install Brother Sam, and on and on and on over the years. No offense to any Uncle Jeffs or Brother Sams in the audience today. Only a handful of tombs that adorn the city are decorated in the classical style that we saw with the Kazna. The vast majority of them, 86% of the 628 facade tombs, are instead decorated with a version of the Merlin or a crenellation, which was a highly charged Achaemenid motif. Also common on Nabataean funerary monuments are rosettes, another symbol laced with meaning that made reference to kingship and frequently used throughout the Achaemenid city of Persepolis. While the 300-year gap between the florescence of Persepolis and the Achaemenid Empire might make the Nabataean connection seem tentative, the frequency of the motif and some near-exact copies from Persepolis suggest that the Nabataeans could have mined the now extinct empire for this visual vocabulary and then wielded it in a provocative act against Rome's increasing eastern aggression. As a visitor continued on through Petra's city center, they would have found other references to Nabataean political might reinforced through art, specifically at the turn of the millennium. You'll notice we keep coming back to that time. In 31 BCE, the Nabataean king Maccaeus I burned Cleopatra's ships, which were sitting on the Red Sea as she prepared to flee. As only a few years earlier, Antony had tried to give parts of the Nabataean territory to Cleopatra, the tensions between the Nabataeans and the Ptolemaic kingdom must have been pretty high. Even if the Nabataeans acted for their more local interest, this support of Octavian, who would later become the first Roman Emperor Augustus, against Cleopatra and Mark Antony would have seemingly put the Nabataeans in a more favorable light in the new Roman Empire, perhaps in opposition to Herod himself, the king of Judea with a Nabataean mother, and who had sent troops to support Antony in Actium. And with that, I think I'm about done with my, my brief yet detailed version of political history. The remains of a fill layer near Petra's Temenos Gate and likely displayed on the main Nabataean temple of Qasr el-Bint seems to narrate a naval battle. Though not an actual battle, the destruction of Cleopatra's ships is an obvious choice for the subject matter. The artistic tradition here is again very classical, not unlike something that sculptors in Roman Alexandria or Turkey or even Greece may have carved. These figures and others from the Nabataean capital are idealized, and close attention was paid to the rendering of the human form, in both ways naturalistic and hyperreal, more beautiful than real life, if you will. We all feel inadequate compared to a Greek sculpture. The portions suggest the sculptors were familiar with those in the Hellenistic and classical Greek world and demonstrate that the Nabataeans were sophisticated consumers of a visual language then popular in the Mediterranean, even if they used it for their own purposes. But the sculptures from Petra and elsewhere in the Nabataean kingdom show a Nabataean appreciation for a different aesthetic tradition as well, one favoring tight curls on the head and chin, and faces dominated by extra-large eyes and a broad, flattened nose. The tradition has precedence from the Assyrian and Achaemenid periods in Mesopotamia. As Mesopotamian influence is so strong elsewhere in Petra, it is unsurprising to see it in sculpture too. It seems the Nabataeans had a different audience in mind and toggled easily between multiple visual languages, a demonstration of their multilingualism, if you will. You see our own piece on the left there. While few of the sculptures were recovered in situ, or the place in that they were used, many of them likely came from the main city center. In the late 1st century BCE and the early 1st century CE, as Rome became an ever more substantial power, the Nabataeans monumentalized the heart of urban activity. In that short time, they built the so-called Great Temple, the main Nabataean temple of Qasr al-Bint, and the Temple of the Winged Lions, all of which we will discuss briefly now. Many, if not most, of Petra's other monumental structures were also built around this time. Again, the Khazna, as well as other structures. This is a map of the city center. On the left, you can see some of what's known based on archaeological evidence. On the right is I would say, an artistic reconstruction of what the city center might have looked like in antiquity. What I really like about this, even as it's not the most accurate, is you can see it was a really thriving place filled with lots of structures that just took up almost all areas, water, and some beautiful painted buildings. The so-called Great Temple may have had religious functions, but the name is a bit misleading. Excavation and interpretation of some of the evidence has suggested the building may have been a royal palace or an administrative center of some sort. Nabataean temples have a distinct footprint, which this structure does not have. As you can see here, it spreads out on 3 levels. This had to be done to accommodate the elevation changes in this area of the city, or rather in all areas of the city. Monumental stairs lead up from the colonnaded street almost 18 meters in length. The stairs lead to the lower temenos and the upper temenos. In the middle, there is a small theatron. It was too small for a large assembly, so I doubt that there was any event that was broadly open to the public, but it may have been used for small performances, religious rituals, or civic ceremonies and events. As there was a theater elsewhere in the city, I showed you that on one of my opening slides, we know that Petra's residents had access to performances of the kind that might have been offered in the Greek world. So this theater at the Great Temple must have had a different use. As we mentioned earlier, control of water was a great Nabataean strength, and this structure was connected to an underground cistern capable of holding approximately 327,000 liters of water. The space had a palatial feel, as it was embellished with relief sculptures that reflected Nabataean conceptions of wealth and power. It had these gorgeous elephant head capitals, frescoes, sophisticatedly carved piasters and capitals. In fact, it is estimated that there were a total of 96 to 120 columns in the lower temenos alone, and some of the capitals with acanthus leaves on them still had gold leaf clinging to them during the excavation. The quarter walls were yellow, red, green, and blue painted stucco. There were 2 massive stucco lion heads recovered as well, perhaps some sort of protective and decorative element. Qasr al-Bint, right next door, is one of the most remarkable freestanding buildings in Petra and in the region, I would argue, but I'm biased, because parts of it are preserved up to 23 meters high. You enter the temple through these monumental stairs made of marble and enter a vestibule that was originally paved in marble. Behind the main space, called the cella, there are 3 compartments. The central of these originally housed an aniconic stone beidel. This was a block of approximately 4 feet high and 2 feet wide, based on the dimensions of the space where it would have been displayed. According to Byzantine lexicon, the base was covered in gold, so it must have been pretty spectacular to see. What is more interesting to archaeologists, however, is that the Byzantine sources, several centuries later, implies that the beidel stood in place for a number of centuries after the Nabataean period ended, perhaps well into the Christian period. It's also possible, although it remains unconfirmed, that the Palmyran Queen Zenobia destroyed the temple as she came through, rampaging the Middle East. Petra also had another nearby temple called the Temple of the Winged Lions on the other side of a colonnaded street. The Temple of the Winged Lions was excavated by an American named Philip Hammond, but he unfortunately passed away before the project could be completely published. But the American Center of Research in Amman has recently produced a final publication of the material, much of it thanks to Jack Green, who is in the audience today. The temple faces the heart of Petra and the so-called Great Temple. Before its excavation, people believed that there may have been a gymnasium there, probably in the Greek style, but excavation revealed a structure with a similar layout to Khirbet. Based on the plasters recovered, we imagine it must have been painted in reds, yellows, greens, and white and black designs. During the 1975 excavation season, the team recovered the temple's beidel, seen here. In the 1st century BCE, the Nabataeans seemingly had a preference for aniconic deities. I've mentioned this word several times, or this meaning that it's non-figurative. While this example is perhaps the best known beidel from Petra, others have been found across the Nabataean kingdom and were produced in a variety of forms. This example seemingly takes its inspiration from the funerary stele of Tema, a site which is now in northern Saudi Arabia. Both portray a schematized face with curved eyebrows and a dominant nose. The wreath running above the eyes on the Petra example may have held precious stones inlaid, and the inscription at the bottom reads, quote, "The goddess of Hawan, son of Nabataean." Attempts to identify which goddess is Hawan have proved frustrating, however, especially since it is more likely than not that more than one deity received a cult in this temple. Despite the lack of a clear answer as to who the deity was, perhaps the most interesting aspect of this idol was the dedicator's emphasis on his personal relationship with them, a relationship made manifest by its permanent presence in a holy space. So who were the people that visited the Temple of the Winged Lions, or Qasr al-Bint, or who gazed at the Great Temple from the colonnaded street and wondered what happened within it? For that, I will take you to an urban villa on the Petra North Ridge. This structure was uncovered in 2016 in an attempt to identify more sub-elite housing. What the team accidentally uncovered instead was a domestic complex complete with a bathhouse, which you can see here. You are not a sub-elite individual if you have a bathhouse in your house. A handful of bathhouses have also been discovered in and around the city, most dating to the 1st century CE. So we know that Petra's occupants had an appreciation of bathing culture, although they built their baths with their own technology and to their own specifications, not those of the Romans. The house overall was richly decorated in brightly colored plaster and marble pavers, and possibly even wall facades. While we aren't exactly sure how the North Ridge rooms were painted, we do know that the Nabataeans, like most of the ancient world, had an appreciation for painted structures. At et-Tanur, another Nabataean villa in Petra, this time behind the Great Temple, the painting depicts an architectural facade on a background of yellowish imitation alabaster. Above the painted decoration and running around the interior of the room up to a height of 1.5 meters was a system of stuccoed architecture in the so-called masonry style of Pompeii, although I would discourage you from reading too deeply into the shared decoration styles. In fact, the rest of the decoration more closely reflects that of Ptolemaic Alexandria, to which there are also many architectural connections in Petra. Thus, these paintings show that the Nabataeans had no issue combining different techniques to create their own anachronistic style. Another beautiful painting can be found in the so-called painted biclinium. This dining hall, built sometime between 40 BCE and 20 CE, like so many other structures we've considered today, represents the best preserved and largest example of Nabataean mural painting. It features a web of intertwined grapes and ivy vines, small cupids, including a flute player and an archer, birds, insects, flowers, and fruits. The grapes and the ivy, as well as the small cupids, flowers, and fruits, suggest the cult of Dionysus, the Greek god of wine and fertility. And this identification is a hard one to challenge, given the space was designed for conviviality and one fit for a king. One of the few ancient authors that records depictions of the Nabataeans, the Greek author Strabo, wrote about the feast that occurred in spaces such as these. He says, quote, "They prepare common meals together in groups of 13 persons, and they have 2 girl singers for each banquet. The king holds many drinking bouts in a magnificent style, but no one drinks more than 11 cupfuls, each time using a different golden cup." Sounds like quite the event, and you may be a little tipsy leaving it. Of course, Strabo's account of the Nabataean tradition is highly problematic, written by a man who had never seen the practices himself, but had heard about them from other, sometimes much older sources. Strabo also didn't hide that he found the Nabataeans strange, and their independence from the Roman Empire made them a target for his Orientalizing slander. But nevertheless, archaeologists trust the core implications of Strabo's description, that the Nabataeans routinely feasted and drank communally, and may have even discarded the vessels that they drank from after their use. Of course, not all of the vessels, or likely any significant amount of them, were made of precious metals. Instead, for the everyday individual, the vessels were likely made out of pottery. Indeed, excavations of sites where communal feasting and drinking occurred are chock full of discarded ceramic bowls and cups. These drinking bowls and cups are some of the most unique in the ancient world. They are made of a local clay harvested from a nearby mountain and spun on a wheel until the walls are remarkably thin, routinely only a couple millimeters thick. That some scholars refer to the vessels as eggshell thin is not a misnomer. The interior of the vessels were then decorated. In the beginning of this ceramic tradition, in the late 2nd or 1st centuries BCE, pot painters favored simple motifs of straight and wavy lines that seemingly referenced the tradition of their geographic predecessors, the Edomites. But later, in the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE, potters began to add vegetative elements. As the 1st century progressed, and at approximately the same time as many of Petra's major monuments were constructed, the potters filled any open space on the vessels' interiors with palmettes, acanthus leaves, pomegranates, and other vegetative shapes, often on top of a bed of parallel lines. Some may have interpreted the Nabataean vegetation version of the hori vacui, or the preference that demanded all empty space be decorated with lush depictions of vegetation, as evidence for the cult of Dionysus in Nabatea. After all, he was a fertility deity. But I want to offer you another idea. Perhaps rather than an appeal to the god Dionysus, or in addition to it, to grant the desert-dwelling people fertility, the preference for greenery on Nabataean painted fineware pottery may have reflected something that the Nabataeans already had: mastery of an arid and often dangerous environment that so often thwarted those that came unprepared. To return to some of the earliest accounts of the Nabataeans, classical writers noted that the Nabataeans had an almost eerie ability to disappear into the desert rocks when threatened by outsiders. The Greek writer Diodorus Siculus, whom we talked about earlier, said that, quote, "They are exceptionally fond of freedom, and whenever a strong force of enemies comes near, they take refuge in the desert, using it as a fortress, for it lacks water and cannot be crossed by others. But to them alone, since they have prepared subterranean reservoirs lined with stucco, it furnishes safety." This is an example of an underground Nabataean period cistern at Humaima, a site that we'll end with. But they were capable of holding very significant amounts of water. Later, sometime after the writings of Diodorus Siculus, the Romans had an encounter with the Nabataean administrator Silas that also demonstrates Nabataean mastery of the landscape. In the years after Cleopatra's death, Rome became increasingly interested in wresting control of the incense trade away from the Nabataeans. The Nabataeans were not known for their fighting ability, and the Roman emperor decided he could, quote, deal with wealthy friends or master wealthy enemies. The Romans thought they had found the former, a wealthy friend in Silas. But Silas was treacherous, according to the Romans, at every turn, leading them through place after place with insufficient roads and water. Gaius set out on the expedition, but he was deceived by the Nabataean administrator Silas, who, although he had promised to be a guide on the march and to supply all the needs and to cooperate with him, acted treacherously in all things and pointed out neither a safe voyage along the coast nor a safe journey on land, misguiding him through places that had no roads and by circuitous routes and through regions destitute of everything. We have from Strabo again. The men and their mounts died in droves, not from Nabataean arrows or swords, but from the very landscape that the Romans had thought to conquer unaided. Roman authors spun the encounter as evidence for Nabataean treachery and even low intelligence, but the outcome was the same. Once again, the Nabataeans defended themselves against outsiders through the mastery of the world in which they lived. As evidenced by just these two accounts which I share here, it should come as no surprise that the Nabataeans rooted their power in their mastery of the desert landscape at the same time as they had struggled against powers much larger than themselves to retain their independence. So remember, Rome is just sitting right to their west and is inching closer and closer as they've conquered Egypt and Judea, and the Nabataeans are now right on the border. Nabataean coins, especially those minted when many of Petra's monuments were being built, and which represent over 50% of all Nabataean coins, reiterated not only Nabataean control of the natural world, but also their integration into the complex systems that transported incense across the Arabian Peninsula and to those in the Mediterranean. This is the most popular coin, and it features crossed cornucopias on the back, an overt reference to Nabataean wealth and control of the natural world. The Jugate bus connected Aratos to historical systems of power, most specifically that of the Ptolemies. Ptolemy II and his wife Arsinoe introduced the motif during his reign. The Ptolemaic king was obviously displayed as the superior ruler, so the Ptolemaic coin is on the right there, due to his frontal placement. But Arsinoe's very presence somewhat mitigated his power, as did her similarly sized portrait. Together, their iconography established them as sibling rulers of a new cult. They were actually brother and sister, and promoted a sense of political stability. The king and queen could produce an heir. The tradition continued on and off until the reign of the last Ptolemaic queen, Cleopatra VII, the Cleopatra, who issued a similarly styled coin to indicate her strong personal and political alliance with Mark Antony, although, of course, for this coin, Cleopatra held the superior foreground position. With such a long history of use that continued into their political present, it is no wonder that the Nabataean king Aretas found this style so compelling. Under Aretas, there was also a shift on the coins from a diadem to the laurel wreath, accompanied by a more Arabian hairstyle. At the turn of the millennium, dynasts from Britain to Syria and beyond wore a diadem in their portraiture. Rome allowed client kings the right to wear such a crown in situations akin to coronation ceremonies, and client kings seemingly never wore anything else. Client kings are essentially rulers that still defer to the Roman Empire. Aretas's predecessor, too, had worn the diadem, but Aretas instead adopted the laurel wreath. As the transition between his rule and Obadas's had proved to be a period of great tension, so much so that Rome became involved, it is possible that the laurel wreath was meant to signal the superior power of their neighbor, where the laurel wreath carried connotations of Rome's supremacy. Who was allowed to wear the Roman laureate was strictly regulated and only appropriate in context of cult, triumph, or military victory. So it remains unclear if the Nabataean king Aretas was attempting to subvert Roman authority or to bow to it. At the same time, it is also a mistake to interpret all Nabataean actions as reactions to the occurrences in the classical world. Aretas may have instead found inspiration for the laurel wreath from southern Arabia, the communities and kingdoms who provided the raw goods that enriched the Nabataeans and through whose lands the Nabataeans routinely passed. A change in the king's hairstyle also accompanied the shift to the wreath. Rather than the long, flowing locks styled in the Hellenistic tradition, Aretas's hair was now wavy or perhaps even braided, falling down his neck, much in the tradition of the Sabines or the Himyarites. Whenever the inspiration for the change originated, it most assuredly communicated strength, independence, and authority. As various combinations of the motifs and trends utilized by the coins of Aretas continued through the coinage of the last Nabataean kings, the message must have been successful. The demonstration of power and control of nature was not just attested on coins and pottery, but also within the heart of Petra. The region of Petra received and receives only 100 to 150 millimeters of rainfall annually. It is largely accepted that at least 300 millimeters of rainfall is needed for sustainable agriculture, and Jordan is now considered one of the most water-poor countries in the world, second by last measure. In this hostile environment, the Nabataeans built an Olympic-sized swimming pool with an island pavilion and a monumental garden connected to the palace. Ongoing excavations since 1998 have revealed that the garden and pool was constructed early in the reign of King Aretas in the late 1st century BCE and continued to be used for several decades after the Roman annexation of the Nabataean kingdom. I mean, it's a nice area. If you're going to take over a desert kingdom, you might as well get the pool and the garden that goes with it. The garden terrace had a series of built features, including 2 stone platforms and a pergola-like structure laid out along its central north-south axis, which was bisected by a stone-lined and colonnaded path along the central east-west axis. Evidence for plantings in the form of tree pits, root cavities, and ceramic potting plants allow the identification of some of the larger plants on the garden terrace. And archaeobotanical analysis has shown that the garden was likely dominated by grapevines, fruit and nut trees, palms, and oleander bushes of the kind that can still be seen in Petra to this day. If you're planning a trip to Petra, go in the spring when the oleanders are out. The pink against the red stone, beautiful. To feed this massive consumption of water, the Nabataeans used the complex system of aqueducts, pressure pipelines, bridges, and arches that they had installed in the Sikh and elsewhere to transport water across rough terrain and deep ravines. Their reservoirs, cisterns, and dams collected every available drop of water from perennial springs, supplemented by runoff catchment of the meager rainfall, in order to provide a reliable water source for the demands of an ever-growing urban population, estimated at around 30,000 at its height. That this water did not just support a massive urban and hinterland population that needed water for crops and animals, but also the ostentatious display of a precious resource must have been striking, even unnerving, to visitors in the city. In the light of this conspicuous consumption of a limited resource that allowed the Nabataeans to remain independent on the fringe of the ever-expanding Roman Empire for centuries after many other cultures in Western Asia had fallen, it is perhaps no surprise then that the Nabataeans embraced floral and vegetative iconography in many aspects of their material culture. Vegetative motifs fill every square inch of their fineware pottery, routinely consumed and then discarded in community feasting events. The crossed cornucopias on their coins asserted their ability to thrive in a hostile landscape, and their garden and pool and other fountains around the city consumed otherwise precious resources in what may have been dangerous amounts for other societies. And through this all, the consumption of water, the manufacture of pottery meant to be consumed and discarded, and the coins carrying messages of multilingualism and abundance, the Nabataeans proved over and over that they were a culture worthy of respect and awe. But before I end, as a little postscript, I'd like to briefly talk about my new project at Humeima, just give you a little hint of some ongoing excavation. Two colleagues from the University of Alberta and I are renewing investigations of the site after an 11-year hiatus. The site of Humeima is located in southern Jordan in the northwest Hisma Desert and is situated approximately equidistant between Petra and Aqaba, a city on the Red Sea coast. Founded by the Nabataeans in the late 1st century BCE, Humeima served to control communication and the flow of goods as a nexus of trade routes. When Trajan, the Roman Emperor Trajan, annexed Nabatea in 106 CE, Humeima became home to the earliest fort in the region, which was built on a low rise to the northeast of the Nabataean settlement. The civilian settlement thrived throughout the Roman and Byzantine periods and into the early Islamic period, when it was home to the Abbasid family before their overthrow by the Umayyad Caliphate. Since 1986, this site has been the focus of archaeological investigation by the Humeima Excavation Project, first under the direction of John Olson of the University of Victoria, and later by Barbara Reeves of Queen's University. It's a really Canadian-heavy project. In spite of almost 30 years of investigation, there still remains a great deal that is unknown about the development of the site and its occupants. This lacuna is particularly true of the site's domestic spaces, the pre-Roman settlement, and local economic production. With that in mind, two colleagues from the University of Alberta and I returned to the site in 2025, or rather, I was 7 months pregnant, so I flew into Amman, got them started, and then they went into the field. Given the 11-year hiatus, our initial short-term goals were to assess the site's condition, including ongoing or future threats to its cultural heritage, and to create a high-definition map of its remains to facilitate future survey and excavation. Long-term goals include the investigation of site resilience and urban life cycles, clarification of site development, and especially during periods of political transition, and the implementation of digital best practices and the creation of a digital archive from previous excavations. With those goals in mind, the Humeima Excavation Project carried out a multifaceted survey of the site from May to June last year. Our survey team documented through photogrammetry 9 significant structures and features at the site, as well as those deemed of poor preservation or at risk of further damage. So photogrammetry is essentially using hundreds of photographs that are then mapped onto a mesh and which create a 3D model that you can manipulate and see from all sides. I'll show you a video in just a second. These structures included the site's Abbasid Qasr and its associated mosques, shown here on the right, and Nabataean tombs to the northwest of the main site on the other side. These photogrammetric models will facilitate future studies of these structures and also record their current state of preservation. So I'm going to show you a video of a model. If you get dizzy, it's about 30 seconds long, just close your eyes. Okay, so this is a Nabataean tomb that is on site. Part of our field work is training students and including people in the community to document their cultural heritage. So this was a model that was made by students from the University of Alberta. There's some holes in it, some white areas that you shouldn't necessarily see. You can see a little cross, Christian reclamation of a Nabataean tomb, which is really interesting, as well as stairs carved into the bedrock that go up above the tomb. This tomb was excavated in the 90s, I believe, but like most of the tombs in Petra, because it was open basically since it was first built, there wasn't much inside it beyond a handful of burials. During the 2025 season, however, we did make some surprising and unexpected discoveries. First, we were made aware of a heavily looted and previously undocumented hypogeum far south of the site. This underground monumental tomb was constructed of carefully dressed Nabataean ashlars inlaid with mortar. So we had 2 rows of 12 loculi each, so these little coffin-shaped boxes that were visible, and there's a possible 3rd row below, giving at least 36 possible burials. Nabataeans like to reuse tombs, so perhaps this was used for a greater number than that. When this newly documented hypogeum is placed into its wider context alongside the other newly identified grave sites and previously excavated rock-cut cyst tombs, a picture begins to emerge of a mortuary landscape to the south and southwest of the main settlement area. Significantly, this region lies along what was now the main southern access route into the settlement, which was later replaced by a Roman road. The result being the more prominent of these tombs would have been visible to those entering and leaving the settlement. Essentially, Humeima is a much, much smaller site than Petra, but we didn't have an idea previously that there was so many similarities between this small desert site that we didn't know much about and the capital city. Therefore, this monumental tomb has a significant potential to enhance our understanding of social organization, mortuary practices, and expressions of status at Humeima in the decades surrounding the region's annexation by Rome. We do hope to excavate this summer. Finally, the team also identified a tower-like structure measuring approximately 3.7 by 4.3 meters that overlooks the site near the crest of a ridge. More illicit digging on the inside revealed an extant wall preserving 7 courses. Carved architectural blocks were found among the surrounding tumble, but not enough of this structure is preserved or was visible to suggest a clear function, although a watchtower or tomb were both possibilities. A little further to the south, we noted the remains of a curved wall on the edge of a natural landscape of bedrock. The east-west orientation of this curved wall strongly suggests that it is the outline of an apse of a church. Therefore, we appear to have the 6th church at Humeima. The site of Humeima is approximately 1 square kilometer. Petra has 3 churches and is 10 times larger, 20 times larger, so this is really interesting. Although no clearing was carried out, the visible wall lines among the tumble give a sense of the structure's size and shape. The potential church measures approximately 22 meters long and 14 meters wide, with an apse of 3.7 meters wide. While further archaeological investigation is required, a 6th church on the site, roughly 1 square kilometer, would reaffirm Humeima's significance in the Byzantine period and perhaps start to explain a bit more of what's leading up to its importance in the Islamic period. So stay tuned for future excavations. And with that, I know I've gone on long. Thank you.
This program was sponsored by the Cincinnati Asian Arts Society. We hope it helped you learn more about Asian art, artists, and culture. For more information about CAS, our schedule of free programs, and recordings of previous programs, please visit cincinnatiasianartssociety.org. That's one word, cincinnatiasianartssociety.org.